Hi guys, welcome back to Codemaster Coach, your medical coding tutor. Guys, we're continuing our review of the 2025 official ICD-10-CM coding guidelines. Last week we stopped after chapter 16, so today we're on chapter 17, congenital malformations, deformations, and chromosomal abnormalities. This can be found between Q00 through Q99. And because this chapter is so short, that's it. Let's go over the guidelines first. Starts off by saying assign an appropriate code or codes from categories Q00 through Q99 for congenital malformations, deformations, and chromosomal abnormalities when a malformation, deformation, or chromosomal abnormality is documented. A malformation, deformation, or chromosomal abnormality may be the principal or first listed diagnoses on a record or a secondary diagnosis. When a malformation, deformation, or chromosomal abnormality does not have a unique code assignment, then assign additional codes for any manifestations that may be present. Just remember, today we're finding more and more congenital conditions, and because the code book might not have it yet, then code the manifestations that the patient's experiencing. I always teach my students signs and symptoms. If they lead to a definitive diagnosis, then only code the definitive diagnoses. But if you can't find that definitive diagnosis in the code book, then all you have are these manifestations that you can code. So in the case with these congenital conditions, if that congenital condition itself is not a main term in your code book, then code the manifestations. It goes on to say, when the code assignment specifically identifies the malformation, deformation, or chromosomal abnormality, manifestations that are an inherent component of the anomaly should not be coded separately. Again, if the signs or symptoms lead to a definitive diagnosis, don't code the signs or symptoms, code the definitive diagnoses. However, additional codes should be assigned for manifestations that are not an inherent component. Other symptoms that the patient may be experiencing that are not leading to a definitive diagnosis can be additional codes. And it just says codes from chapter 17 may be used throughout the life of the patient, not just at birth. And if a congenital malformation or deformity has been corrected, then a personal history code should be used to identify the history of the malformation or deformity. Although present at birth, a malformation, deformation, or chromosomal abnormality may not be identified until later in life. And whenever the condition is diagnosed by the provider, it is appropriate to assign a code from codes Q00 through Q99. And for the birth admission, the appropriate code from category Z38, live-born infant, according to the place of birth and the type of delivery, should be sequenced as the principal diagnoses, followed by any congenital anomaly codes Q00 through Q99. Because remember, on the birth record, you first must identify the live-born infant. All right, let's go to my outline. Chapter 17 is a short chapter, and it just says, again, for chapter 17, congenital malformations, deformations, and chromosomal abnormality. These codes are Q00 through Q99. My note just says codes that start with a Q are congenital conditions. Congenital anomalies are abnormal conditions present at birth, but may not be recognized until later in life. Therefore, these codes can be used throughout the life of the patient. You're not just going to see Q codes on the baby chart. You could see a Q code on an adult chart. The patient's age is not the determining factor when assigning congenital conditions. Age is not the determining factor. Congenital conditions that may have future healthcare implications are reported for newborns even if they are not further evaluated or treated during the current episode of care. Let me explain this one, because remember, up to this point, based on the guidelines, if a condition was not treated, whether it's clinically evaluated or therapeutically treated or resources were used, we didn't code it in the past. But this is letting you know, if it's a congenital condition that may have a future healthcare implications that are reported for the newborns, even if they are not further evaluated or treated during the current episode of care, you will capture. I think of my children. My children were born with sickle cell trait. They weren't treated for it, but because they do have that sickle cell trait, it was captured on their newborn record at birth. It wasn't treated, but it was identified. So congenital conditions that may have future healthcare implications are reported for newborns even if they are not further evaluated or treated during the current episode of care. Next, I have a purple note. Now, you know my purple notes are my Codemaster Coach notes. These are my notes. And it just says, as you become more and more familiar with your code book, because remember, Coach is reminding you to love your code book and it will love you back with the right answer, you will start to have an idea before you even look up the code based on the body system or the condition that you're coding, what letter the code should start with. For example, pregnancy, childbirth, and the purpurium codes. We just covered those previously. We know they start with the letter O. Well, after studying today's video, you'll know that congenital conditions begin with the letter Q. So start to get that familiar from loving on your code book, what letter the code is going to start with. I have some more notes. Most congenital conditions are identified under the actual condition as a subterm. However, please note that some conditions can only be congenital conditions and therefore can be identified only at the main term. And I want to give you an example of this. Hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus can be either acquired or congenital. So I'll go to main term, hydrocephalus. And then based on that main term, then identify it as either acquired or congenital. But there are some conditions that are only congenital conditions. Therefore, they're going to be identified at the main term. When the actual condition is not identified in the code book, then identify the manifestations of the anomaly. And what's happening, we're finding more and more babies born with conditions that haven't yet even been put in the code book. So in a case like that, it's saying if the actual condition is not in your or identified in your code book, then identify the manifestations, the signs or symptoms. What is the result of having that condition? And in conditions due to birth injury are not, let me highlight that, not bold, congenital conditions, and are classified as perinatal conditions in categories P10 through P15 for birth trauma. So again, conditions due to birth injury are not congenital conditions, and they're classified under perinatal conditions. All right, and that's it, guys. Next week we'll be in chapter 18, symptoms, signs, and abnormal clinical and laboratory findings not elsewhere classified, NEC. They'll be found between codes R00 through R99. And let me make sure the guidelines we covered. Oh, yep, we're down to chapter 18. All right, guys. Thanks. I'll see you in the next one.